Okay, so welcome to our conversation on Black farm families. Let's get into it. And so we see many Black farm families remaining in systems of involuntary servitude, which basically means that they are laboring against their will, right? And so many of these Black families that remained in the South, they lived in small cabins that did not have running water. They did not have electricity, and they were often rather drafty, and so they would get cold, right? Um, Medical care was often unavailable because who can pay for a doctor? But also, if you're in rural areas, there are far fewer resources like hospitals, like doctors, and so you also find that many people's diets were deficient in vitamins as well as protein. We're going to kind of go through and talk about different forms of agricultural labor that African Americans found themselves in. And so you have renters. Many African American farmers preferred renting to sharecrop. And so you have tenants who would pay a flat fee to rent a given amount of acres, right? And so payment could be given in the form of cash monies or a specified amount of crop. And these tenants often would own their own animals. They would also own their own tools. Most Black farm families were sharecroppers, right? Though renting was ideal, it was far less common, right? And so sharecropping began during the Reconstruction era, which basically means that folks literally got out of slavery and went right back into it. And you're like, what do you mean, Hamilton? Let's talk about it. So you'd have the landowners, many of which were former slave masters, right? Who allowed the use of their land for a portion of the crop that was produced. The landlord also would provide housing, tools, food, and clothing. And the landowner would receive half to 3/4, 75% of your crop. Sharecropping was extremely exploitative. Why? Because oftentimes verbal agreements were being made, and those verbal agreements were considered to be contracts. However, as all of you know who watch court TV, people can lie, right? So you can say like, oh, you know, we agreed to half your crop, half of my crop, right? And then the landlord can be like, no, we didn't. We agreed to 90%, or we agreed to 3/4 of it. Who are you going to call? Who are you going to tell that your landowner is cheating you? No one. No one. So the landowner, and also especially because you most likely were illiterate, right? Which is a part of why you're making a verbal agreement in the first place. This also means that even if you were to create a written contract, that if you cannot read your written contract, then your landowner could pretty much write anything and you would go along with it and they could read you something different, but then you can't really sue in court because you might have signed something that was completely exploitative without your knowledge, right? Also, exploitation creeps in because you have the landowner telling the sharecropper how much the product that was harvested was worth, and also tell them the value of the goods provided, which means that you are continually, as a landowner, undercutting the sharecropper in terms of establishing how much a good is worth, how much the crop is worth. And then we also see people in the roles of cotton brokers and gin owners. And by gin, I mean cotton gin, not the bottle, not gin that gin. And so we see these cotton brokers and gin owners routinely paying black farmers less than white farmers per pound of cotton, because sharecropping is a common system throughout the South, period. Whether you're black or you're white, sharecropping was a part of life for many people in the South who were poor. And so you have sharecroppers and renters often in debt to various merchants for food, for clothing, for farm supplies. And so the merchant would give out an advance of the merchandise, but take out a lien on the crop. And this was called a crop lien, right? And so if someone failed to repay the merchant, then the merchant was entitled to all or a large part of your crop once the landowner received his payment. So picture it. 1900. You have a farm. Well, you don't have a farm. You're sharecropping for a landowner that wants 3/4 of your crop. You said, okay, fine. But you fell on some hard times. So then you have to go to a merchant in order to get an advance, because you got to feed your wife and your kids, or your husband and your kids, or you just yourself and your siblings. I don't know, whomever you want to feed in this scenario. And some of your tools broke. So they're willing to give you an advance, but they're saying, hey, we want 15% of your crop. So that means that when all of it comes out in the wash, or when it's time to harvest, that 3/4 of your crop, so 75% of your crop, is going to the landowner. An additional 15% of your crop is going to the merchant, which leaves you 10% for yourself. And with that 10%, that is not enough to subsist, right? And then you also have these merchants charging high prices as well as high interest rates, right? Like, there was no Amazon. You can't sit here and find a cheaper source. You can't find a cheaper hoe or a cheaper rake somewhere else, right? And so it's like you have to go to these merchants who are overcharging you because you're black. You have to utilize these landlords who are ripping you off because you're black, even though the white farmer across the way, or the white sharecropper across the way, is getting a far better deal than you, and you know it. And literally all you are trying to do is survive, but a part of your survival is perpetually being in debt, right? The system we find African American farm laborers perpetually in was peonage. Now, peonage is a system basically of paying back debt through servitude and or labor. And it is another form of involuntary servitude, right? And so we see so many farmers who were cheated, who experienced the decline of crop prices as a result of the Gilded Era, and technological innovation, who had to deal with bad weather. And so many of these farmers fell deep into debt. And so this led them to be basically in a state of peonage. And mind you, they could not leave. You can't just be like, fuck it, I ain't gonna be a farmer no more. I'm gonna be somebody else. You couldn't do that. Because your debt had to be paid in order for you to leave. You were beholden to the land, right? Sheriffs would go after you if you just up and left. So now you become a fugitive in the American South around the turn of the century. Now, mind you, peonage is illegal, right? It violated federal law. However, the law was rarely enforced. So, do what you want if you're white. And this system of peonage left thousands of black families in perpetual enslavement until the 1960s and 70s. And speaking of peonage and other illegal things, the one thing you definitely didn't want to do was get caught up in the prison system in the South. Honestly, just like now, you don't want to get caught up in the prison system, period, right? Especially not in our prison happy America. So this convict leasing system is something that now we have to talk about. And then for those of you who are looking on the right hand side, you might be like, are those fucking children? Yes. So let's get into it, shall we? So the condition of Southern prisons were atrocious. You have many black prisoners who are incarcerated for misdemeanors, such as vagrancy. And so vagrancy potentially speaks to a host of things, right? But first and foremost, it speaks to somebody who does not have a job and potentially is homeless, someone who is loitering, which means basically you're standing around outside, or people who are gambling, who are drunk, who are engaging in prostitution. All of these things kind of fall under the larger framework of vagrancy, right? So basically that means that as a black person in America, it was potentially, if you were found without employment, which who's gonna employ you, standing around, that potentially you could get caught up and tried for vagrancy and sentenced to prison, right? Also, you could be incarcerated for theft, disorderly conduct, which disorderly conduct can mean a whole bunch of things in this context. And by this context, I mean the social etiquette of the American South during the Jim Crow era. And so orphans and juvenile offenders were also leased. Mind you, when I say orphans, I mean literally like you did not have to commit a crime and be an orphan. But as an orphan, they're like, oh yeah, sure, you don't have parents. We're gonna incarcerate you? So the convict leasing system, basically you would have businesses and planters leasing incarcerated peoples from the state, the same way that you would like lease a car, okay? Lease an apartment, to build roads, to clear swamps, to cut timber, to tend cotton, to work in mines. And the company or planter had to feed, clothe, and house these prisoners, right? The state no longer had to maintain jails anymore. And they also received revenue. Ooh, I know this sounds familiar to y'all, in the form of private prisons today. And so the state of Georgia, for example, in 1878, leased out 1,239 prisoners. All but 115 of them were black. The state of South Carolina was paid $3 a month per prisoner. This system was worse than slavery because black lives in this context had absolutely no value to either the government or the businesses involved. Because at least during slavery, there was an impetus to keep black people alive because you bought them and they were your property. Here, you're just leasing them. So if they die, it doesn't matter. You just find another one to arrest and bring on and do this labor. The death rate of prisoners leased to railroad companies between 1877 and 1879 was 16% in Mississippi, 25% in Arkansas, and 45% in South Carolina. However, due to the extreme brutality, high death rates, and just insidious nature of the convict leasing system, it was abolished in the 1930s. And the most brutal form of convict leasing was the chain gang. You have chain gangs being originated as a massive road development project in the 1890s. Georgia was the first state to begin using chain gangs to work male convicts who were felons outside of prison walls. These people are literally chained together. This is why it's called a chain gang, right? So you have the chains wrapped around the ankles of prisoners, shackling 5 together while they worked, ate, and slept. For over 30 years, you have African American prisoners and some white prisoners in the chain gangs being worked at gunpoint, under whips, and very much being whipped while they're enchained, right? And this was very much a public spectacle that was reminiscent of chattel slavery and also a form of torture. And so eventually the brutality and violence that was associated with chain gang labor in the US gained worldwide attention. And so as a result of the US not wanting to look bad, we see chain gangs being abolished in every state by the 1950s. And so this wraps up our conversation about African American families in the South and their struggle to survive through systems of sharecropping, and also having to navigate a growing system of incarceration. Stay tuned for more History with Hamilton. Take care.